We're going to open proceedings.
I understand I'm sharing time with Deputy Brazel and yourself. When you come back here, Deputy Farrell is going to replace you. First of all, Minister, as my colleague last night indicated, Fianna Fáil would be supporting this bill and will have a number of amendments coming forward at committee stage. And I suppose it's important to put in context, that we're talking about a bill in terms of the private rented sector. And there is huge demands on the private rented sector at the moment. And, we have seen for a number of years very significant rental increases. And it goes back to the basic issue of supply and demand. And in this case, quite simply, there is too much demand. It's on the demand side the pressures have occurred rather than the supply side. And in terms of the private rental sector, it's important to acknowledge that. And if you just look at it generally, there are people who are living in private rented accommodation today who don't want to be there. They're there because there is no alternative and no option. They're people who have an eligibility for social housing and who are there in a temporary capacity who are waiting for that social housing. And there are people also who don't qualify for social housing, who are earning money, who are earning significant money, don't qualify for social housing. They're in private rented accommodation and have no capacity to save the requisite deposit to purchase their own home. And in those regards, Minister, in the longer term, and I divert slightly from the bill, it is worth noting that some of the elements, to alleviate the pressure on the private rental sector is the continuing growth and supply of social housing, as well as affordable housing. And while we might disagree on aspects of it, my view is we don't have a rational programme around providing affordable housing. I look at in my own area where we have a couple of SDZs under construction and whatever. The reality is we don't have an affordable housing programme for people who are earning a salary that's in excess of what would make them eligible for social housing. They're excluded from the market, and many of those people are in private rented accommodation, and we need to deal with that. And the other issue that has been spoken about time and time again, Minister, and again it's putting pressure on the market, is we don't have this cost rental. We don't have a cost rental scheme, a cost rental model in place. And really and truly, we've spoken about it for a number of years. It should be developed at this stage. It should be accessing funds that would be available from pension funds, or in fact, from that matter, from the League of Credit Unions. And until we address some of those key issues, in my view, the private rented sector is going to continue under pressure. And I think it's important that we put this debate in that context. And the piece of legislation we're addressing tonight is to address some of the issues that we're facing on a day-by-day basis. And I acknowledge that the government introduced rent pressure zones. How they operate, people have mixed views on it. And I would say that colleagues around the country argue the point at this stage that they need to be extended to other geographic areas where they're seeing significant rent increases. The rent pressure zones were obviously designed to restrict the level of rent income, and there were various exemptions around if there were significant renovations, and obviously the existing regulations in legislation around landlords being able to ask tenants to move on because they wanted to sell an apartment or a house, or they wanted the property for their own family member. They've been around a long time. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people would suggest that these measures aren't being policed, and this legislation gives an opportunity that should happen, and I think that's really important. I think all of us who are public representatives on a regular basis see people presenting in our offices and they're being told, I have to move from my private rented accommodation because the landlord wants to sell, or the landlord needs it for a family, or it's been renovated. And sometimes it's very hard to see, does that transaction ever happen? So in terms of this legislation, I think that's a key piece that has to happen. I think the activities of landlords in that regard has to be overseen, and I think this legislation will help that. And for the majority of landlords, by the way, being compliant isn't an issue. They acknowledge and respect it. They want transparency. They believe that landlords need to be held responsible and want to be seen. Their reputation for many people is important to them. People have spoken earlier on during the debate around the annual registration of tenancies, and that's a departure from the current system. What I would say, Minister, is the legislation didn't specify, and I understand it's a reduced rate, didn't specify what the rate of annual registration would be in terms of the charge. And I think that from the landlord's point of view, there shouldn't be an additional burden. I think there's an additional administrative burden doing it annually. And I think there needs to be a responsibility on the RTB that when a landlord registers, that notification would go in terms of reminders and that landlords wouldn't inadvertently get caught. I think it's important that it doesn't all rely on the landlord having to remember and so forth, that if you're doing that scheme, and maybe, you know, it is important that you might point out why it is necessary to do an annual registration if a landlord and tenant relationship is enduring longer than for a year. One of the issues, I suppose, that rises from the landlords, and a lot of the actions you've taken in this is to, I suppose, influence the behaviour and manage the behaviour of landlords. But one of the issues since you've introduced the rent pressure zones that landlords have brought to our attention, Minister, is the fact that we have some historical, I suppose, situations where landlords would have previously allowed tenants stay at a rent that is way, way below, significantly below market value, and they don't seem to have a mechanism to correct that, particularly if the tenant moves on. And I think it's important that, you know, that might be looked at. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, there's a free-for-all, but there are cases where landlords have presented where their rents they're charging, and I've seen them in my own area, are significantly, not marginally, significantly below market value, how they might be in a position to address that situation. I believe, from the point of view of transparency, Minister, it is really, really important that we have a register of what the rents actually charged are. Because frequently we come in here and we listen to the debate around the DAFT reports saying that rents have gone up. They're the asking rents rather than the charged rents. And sometimes there's a difference. So I think it's important that a proper register be established to look at the rents charged, because that transparency isn't there. And it would influence those who are going to the market in what, you know, it would empower them to know what actual rents are. Minister, 2 points, because I want to conclude. I have two colleagues. 2 points that aren't directly in the bill that I would like you to consider, and I know Deputy O'Brien has brought them up to you. One is in relation to the fact that student accommodation isn't included in the rent pressure zones, and I believe it should be. And I think this is an opportunity with this piece of legislation to look at that aspect. And also, which had been previously spoken about, was a national deposit scheme. Two final points which might be slightly outside, but very, very directly related to the Residential Tenancy Board. In terms of disputes, in terms of antisocial behaviour, the legislation as currently framed states that only a person who is directly and adversely affected by antisocial behaviour can make a complaint. In my experience, and I have case after case, I have constituents who are afraid to make that complaint. And in the absence of them making a complaint, nothing can be done. I'd ask you, Minister, to think of expanding that section, that somebody other than the person who is adversely affected, an advocate, a public rep or a third party, on their behalf can make it. And some of the cases, Minister, and I'm not going to put them on the record of the Dáil, but are very, very serious, where people are genuinely afraid to make that complaint. The legislation needs to be amended to afford a complaint to be made on their behalf. And the final point that I want to make is, we've talked, you know, about this legislation and how it will impact on landlords and whatever. It is really important that it has a positive impact and a positive benefit, not just in terms of price, but in terms of the quality of life of the tenant. And in that regard, Minister, I would urge you to look again in terms of our inspections of properties. You've increased the funding year on year, but it's going to take another number of years until local authorities are inspecting 1 in 4 properties. And the interesting thing was, the last year I looked, I think it was 2017, there was 16,000 properties inspected, and over 12,000 of them didn't meet the standard. That's showing us the scale of work that needs to be done. Those tenants who are paying very, very significant amounts of money deserve to live in better conditions than that. And what I'm suggesting, Minister, is that your target of 2021 or 22 to get to 1 in 4 properties being inspected needs to be fast-tracked. It is relatively small money. I think you're increasing the fund for property inspections by local authorities to by the sum of £2.5 million per year. I'm asking you to consider fast-tracking that so as we have a much more realistic property inspection and the standard of property rented in the private rented sector improves significantly. Curran.